Hi everybody, I'm Fran Spielman, and with me in the Sun-Times newsroom is someone who's had a great week. Amara Enyia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You had the endorsement of Chance the Rapper. How did that come about?
So interestingly, Chance apparently had been a fan of mine for a long time, and I had been a fan of his from afar though. So we found ourselves in a lot of similar spaces because of our organizing work and our work in the community. So, but we had never formally met. So he actually reached out to me. It was sort of out of the blue, and he said, you know, I think you're dope. Definitely want to connect with you, want to talk about what's going on in the city. And I said, I'm a fan as well. And so we met and we started talking and it just clicked. So, and that was sort of how we finally formally met.
And it started with a text message, a phone call? How?
Yeah, it was a text message, I think, and then a phone call. And then we met fairly quickly after that. And we clicked immediately. We have a lot of things in common in terms of really being committed to community and doing a lot of organizing work and trying to use our platforms to advocate for a lot of the issues that we care about. So we were so much aligned, and we see the significance of this particular election cycle and what needs to happen for the city. So it's been fun as well. It's been great.
Now, what exactly is he going to do for you?
So typically with sort of celebrity endorsements, it's sort of a flash in the pan, one-shot deal. We actually are going to be working together and essentially co-campaigning for a lot of events around the city. We have many events planned where we're going to be talking about key issues around Chicago's economy, around education, a lot of the things that we've been active on. We also have a lot of grassroots events that we'll be doing out in the community, public speeches, just rallying people, getting people excited, and of course fundraisers as well. And tapping into all of our networks to really make this to create a groundswell of excitement and enthusiasm about the campaign. So we're going to be working together and co-campaigning essentially until the end of the election cycle.
And has he provided you with ideas for programs, for things that he would like done if you were to be elected?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about, you know, what does the first 10 days look like? What are the big ideas that we have that we can actually talk about to get people excited?
All right, so give me some ideas that he's given you.
So he has talked about, so one of the things that he really cares about is expanding mental health services in Chicago. And so actually a couple of weeks ago, he donated $1 million to that end. And so we've talked about how do you expand these services in communities, but also how do you make sure that in CPS, for example, kids have access to licensed social workers and nurses. And so we're thinking about ways to shift investment to expanding those services in the community. He also talks about, we talked together about education equity, so this issue of student-based budgeting and what it means for schools that are actually experiencing population loss, which means they have less funding. And so our analysis of the student-based budgeting model and how do we infuse it with equity so that it's actually the schools that need those resources are able to get it. So we've talked about some creative ways of
What
doing
are they?
that.
Like what creative ways?
So it's actually revamping the formula with an equity model. So it looks at schools not based upon the number of students that they get, but what those schools actually need. Right now, if a school has a lower population, they get fewer dollars. And right now we have a situation where schools are actually competing for a smaller and smaller number of students because CPS population has been declining over the last several years. So what that means is schools in the most challenged communities which are experiencing that population loss are actually having to slash their budgets, and then if they're not getting access to CPS dollars, they're not getting as much access to CPS dollars. We have to have a budgeting formula that actually says these schools in these challenged areas have a higher need for these sorts of positions. We have not done that in CPS. We've stuck with that model. So one of the things that we want to do is actually creating a new model through an equity lens.
An equity lens. So that would mean that you would rob from Peter to pay Paul, really, right?
Not at all. It actually means that
well, the dollars have to come from someplace else.
Right, so they would come from CPS as a whole, but as one school district, we shouldn't even see our one school district as Peter and Paul. It's one district where we recognize that there are some areas and some schools that have really been not getting the kinds of resources that they need to do justice for the students who go to those schools. So it is in everyone's collective interest to make sure that we have high quality neighborhood schools across the city. That means assessing how CPS allocates funds for its capital expenditures and also its programmatic expenditures. When we looked at, so I've been doing a lot of research in how CPS allocates programmatic expenditures, and we actually found a disparity, for example, in IB programs, where on the west side of Chicago there are very few if at all, IB programs that are available for students, whereas we see a preponderance of those on the north side of Chicago. And so our responsibility is to say, how do we make sure that kids who live in this part of town also have access to those IB programs or STEM programs or other sorts of programs that everyone else has access to. That's the responsibility of the district, and it's only fair so that people don't have to feel that they are at a disadvantage just by virtue of where they live.
What would you do about the half-empty or even worse, high schools and grade schools on the west side, on the south side, as population has declined?
Well, and that is a testament to the fact that the city administration had not planned for the population decline. So there was absolutely no planning done to anticipate what was happening in our communities. We now have an opportunity, in our view, to actually reimagine what an educational experience could look like with some of that infrastructure that is now empty. In many communities, I've worked with many, and in fact have worked personally on a project that reimagines closed schools as centers for learning, as centers for where communities can actually put forth new innovative projects. One that we came up with was an arts and culture campus, where we're bringing in arts-based entrepreneurs, arts-based programs, and actually creating a campus that could be an economic driver in a community that had more than 4 schools closed. That kind of innovation is what's necessary, even as we're looking at schools that are emptying out around the city.
Well, you're talking about schools that are already closed, the 50 from a couple of years ago, the biggest in the history. I'm talking about the ones that are still half empty that need to be closed. What would you do about those?
We have to think about what is in the best interest of the students in those schools first, making sure that they have access to high quality schools. One example is, for example, in Inglewood, where they decided to close all of the schools and had no
build
plan
one new one.
Precisely. But
what would you do about that?
Well, the new one, the problem with that plan was that they were going to bar existing students from the closed schools from even entering the new schools. Those students should have actually gotten top priority to be a part of that new school. That's one of the things
and they modified it a little bit.
Yes, after a lot of pushback, and
right.
I was involved in a lot of
But
that.
I'm asking you, what do you do about the schools that are half empty or less?
So it's about having a plan for those students to make sure that they get into, if we're moving students into other schools, they have to be moving into high quality schools. So we have to care about what happens with those students. When we closed schools last time, they did not plan for those students to get into better situations. And so the research actually showed that they did worse academically than had they stayed in those half empty schools. So we have to prioritize what's actually in the best interest of the student. Is closing that entire school in the best interest of the kids in that school? If so, how do we make sure that we're putting them in better situations than the ones that they're coming out of? And how do we think about using those buildings in innovative ways for the students while they're still there?
Now, why should we care what Chance the Rapper thinks? He's a great musician, he's won Grammys, he's been generous with his time and money.
Yes.
But why should the voters care who his candidate is?
It is important in a city where the registered voters who actually came out to vote in the last election was only 30%. It is important because this is an election where we have to tap into people who have felt particularly disenfranchised or ignored in the electoral process, or can't be bothered to get involved because it doesn't resonate with them, because they don't see themselves in any of the politicians that are before them. Chance is someone who brings substance, not just celebrity. And that was very important for me, because my track record is all about the substance, the things that I've done. So he's someone who's invested his money in Chicago, whether it's CPS and mental health resources. He started a foundation called Social Works, which actually works with youth in Chicago public schools, does leadership development. And he's a great musician, and he has a great network. So for us, it's about who can bring the excitement and the enthusiasm for people to actually get involved. We're not just focusing on the 30% of likely voters. We see a whole universe in that 70% that can finally see a message and a campaign and a platform that resonates with them. And he is helping us to do that in spades.
Well, also, the city is at a perilous, perilous time. $1 billion spike in pension payments will hit you in the face if you're lucky enough to become mayor of Chicago, or maybe unfortunate enough. What is your plan to handle that?
So the pension crisis, if you will, is part of a larger, for us, a larger economic plan that has to be part of the city's moving forward. That includes creating a growth economy that includes where we can generate revenue. A lot of people talk about paying for the pensions, and it's just by virtue of what taxes we're going to increase. But for the city to be fiscally solvent, it has to address the issue of revenue and implement transformative policies that not only stabilize our finances, but bring in revenue from many different areas.
Okay, go ahead, tell us.
Yes, so the hallmark of our economic platform is definitely we believe in protecting pensions, so we have to.
Well, you have to. That's
exactly.
law.
It's constitutionally mandated, and just morally, it's the
and
right
it's
thing
in
to
state
do.
law now. You've got to get them to 90% funding in 40 years.
Exactly. So the two areas where we see we can actually generate revenue for the city, one is something that I've talked about is addressing the waste that happens. So we're paying $1.7 billion just in police misconduct settlements. That comes out of the city's operational costs.
Okay, good luck with that. But that's not an answer to this immediate problem.
It is.
It's long-term a goal, and certainly should be.
Because it saves, if we're paying $1.7 billion just in police misconduct settlements, that's $1.7 billion that we don't have
It's
to
not
pay
a
into the
year.
pension.
That's not a year. It's over a period of time.
It's over a period of time,
Sure.
but over the next few years, this is still our tax dollars that are going into that.
I understand, but
So the
what are
point
your
is-
immediate ideas for this spike that's going to hit you? You can't have a long-term plan like that. You've got to have an immediate.
Well, the problem has been that we haven't had a long-term plan for revenue for the city ever, and that plan now has been borrowing, which is not effective for future generations, and it has been raising taxes, which has become unsustainable. It's actually contributing to population loss. And so for us, it's about shoring up the population. One of the things that we talk about economically is is actually shifting to a public bank for the city of Chicago.
How would that work?
So public bank is a bank whose only allegiance is to the taxpayers. Its only responsibility is to make sure that the city's economy is strong. You can use that bank actually to fund our infrastructure projects at very low interest. Right now we pay 40 to 50% higher on interest to private banks. That's money that is wasted. That's money that actually can be recirculated into our economy. It can also issue low interest loans for small business owners. If we're going to generate revenue, we have to create a stronger environment for our business owners because they pay taxes and they pay fees and they pay fines to the city. It is extremely transformative, and it prevents us from paying the hundreds of millions that we currently pay to private banks on bad bank deals, on renegotiating those bad bank deals. That is costing the city money. So a public bank is actually foundational to moving the city's economy into the direction it needs to go in, and it's also a mechanism for generating revenue.
Where does the money come from for that?
So it's capitalized by existing assets that we currently hold in private banks. So you don't have to have a huge infusion of new money. It's a matter of shifting those funds into the public bank, where the allegiance is actually to the public and not to shareholders for private banks.
Well, wait, the assets come from the city's assets, or the city's tax revenue goes into the bank?
Yes, so the city right now currently holds its funds in private banks. So
Right,
any
like
number
the
of them.
treasurer's office does.
So you can actually shift the funds that are currently held in private banks, you can actually shift them into a public bank for the city. So you don't have to come up with new capital to capitalize the bank. That's why it's not as heavy a lift as people think. This actually exists elsewhere in the country. So North Dakota has a public bank. It's the strongest, highest performing bank in the country. Other cities like New York, Los Angeles, and almost 15 other cities have moved in that direction. The governor-elect, the new governor of New Jersey, has made that the hallmark of his platform. I work on this issue nationally. So those who are looking for innovative ideas that actually address the economic circumstances in cities, they're already moving in this direction, and we believe that Chicago should be leading on this because it affects everything from our ability to have a strong business climate, our ability to generate additional revenue, our ability to create stability in the housing market, which we really suffered from years ago. These are the kinds of ideas that we have to implement, but it takes the kind of vision to put them on the table.
What kind of revenues would you raise when you have to raise taxes, which you will have to do? Which revenues would you choose?
I think it's about not just, so we have to look at who these increases are affecting. There are better ways of raising revenue that do not fall disproportionately on those who can least afford to pay.
Go ahead.
So for example, we talk about at the state level having a progressive income tax versus a flat tax. It's a much more fair way of generating revenue. When you think about things like tickets,
Very
fines, and
difficult
fees,
to achieve. You have to go to a constitutional amendment. What is
Right.
your immediate local solution that you as mayor could do?
So it is about the process. When you think about increasing your fines, fees, and tickets, the research has shown that those taxes we call them forfeitures, they are actually hitting lower income people and communities. We actually have to look at that. So instead of just raising property taxes across the board or raising the cost of a ticket across the board, which the city has done, we have to look at how do we make sure that these increases are not hurting those who can least afford to pay. That
so
analysis
what
is
are
not
your
been done.
what are your revenue ideas that wouldn't hit the little guy?
It's about looking at how they're implemented. So instead of saying we're going to